The cop sat in his squad car parked at the edge of the quiet street, the hum of the engine barely audible in the cool evening air. He glanced out the window, scanning the scene for anything out of place. The neighborhood was calm, too calm for his liking. It always made him nervous. When things felt too quiet, his eyes moved from house to house until they landed on her, a black woman, walking alone down the sidewalk. Her stride was purposeful but unhurried, and he found that unsettling. Something about her didn't fit with the image he had in his mind of what was suspicious, and yet his instincts told him something was off. The woman wore a dark jacket and faded jeans. Her face was unreadable, but her presence seemed to fill the space in a way that made the officer uneasy. She walked like she owned the place, but that was the kind of confidence he didn't like to see in someone who didn't belong. In his mind, she was out of place, even though she hadn't done a thing wrong. His grip tightened around the steering wheel as he considered his options. Maybe she was just passing through, or maybe she was up to something. She didn't look like she belonged here, but that was exactly why he had to stop her, to make sure she was who she said she was. He wasn't going to let his guard down. He wasn't going to make the mistake of letting someone slip through his fingers, not on his watch. He threw the car into gear and drove a little closer, keeping a watchful eye. As he slowed down next to her, rolling the window down just enough to speak to her, his voice was gruff and commanding as he asked her to stop for a moment. The woman didn't seem surprised or startled. She simply stopped and turned toward him, her expression unreadable. She didn't seem rattled or alarmed, just calm, too calm. He thought there was something in the way she held herself, something about her presence that struck him as off-putting. She didn't seem like she was about to flee or make an excuse. She was waiting for him to say whatever he needed to say, with a look in her eyes that was almost defiant, without saying a word. "What do you need?" he asked curtly, and she simply stared at him for a moment before responding with a soft, no-nonsense tone, just a simple answer. But it made his skin crawl. She didn't flinch, didn't act like she was afraid. She didn't seem the least bit concerned about the situation. This only added to the growing sense of suspicion in his gut. "You're out here alone," he pressed, eyes narrowing. Something about her didn't add up. She didn't belong here, he thought. She was too composed for a woman walking through a neighborhood like this. The way she carried herself made it clear she wasn't the kind of person who would be caught unaware, who would slip up under pressure. The woman didn't answer right away. She stood there waiting, almost as if she was deciding whether or not to humor his questions at all. The officer took that as another sign of defiance. She wasn't intimidated by his presence. She wasn't following the script he expected from people when he stopped them. She wasn't playing the game he was used to seeing. He didn't like that. It made him feel out of control, made him feel like she had some kind of upper hand. He wasn't used to that. He repeated his question, this time with more force in his voice. "You got ID on you?" The woman's gaze remained steady, locked on his with a quiet confidence that unsettled him even more. Then she shook her head slowly, like she was making a decision, and then in one smooth motion she reached for her pocket. But instead of pulling out a wallet or ID, she slid her hand into her coat pocket, and the officer felt a sudden surge of alarm rush through him. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how things were supposed to go. But before he could react, she stepped forward, as if daring him to take action. The officer's instincts kicked in the moment she moved forward. He gripped the door handle, ready to leap out if he needed to. He couldn't afford to let her get the upper hand. He told himself whatever she was planning, he needed to stop it now. He couldn't be caught off guard like this again. The woman's hand was still in her pocket, but she didn't seem threatening. She wasn't reaching for a weapon. She wasn't pulling anything out to defend herself. And yet there was something about her body language that made him pause. She wasn't scared. She wasn't acting like a person about to get arrested. She wasn't following the usual pattern he was used to seeing in people when they were caught. She stood her ground, and that unsettled him more than anything else. He had seen that kind of quiet defiance before, but never in someone who didn't seem the least bit nervous. He took a step forward, demanding once more that she take her hand out of her pocket, but she didn't move. Her hand didn't come out. She only looked at him, still calm, still steady. Her gaze didn't waver even as his words became sharper, more forceful. She was testing him. He realized she was waiting to see how far he would push before he made his move. But he wasn't backing down, not now, not when he was so sure she was hiding something. He was ready to escalate things. He couldn't let this go. The longer he let her act like she was in control, the harder it would be for him to gain the upper hand. "Do you have any idea who I am?" he demanded, his voice rising slightly with frustration at her continued silence. Her eyes narrowed slightly, but still no sign of fear, no sign of worry. Just that same unreadable calm. He didn't know what to make of it. But he wasn't going to back down, not when she was making him feel like he was the one in the wrong here. Not when she had the audacity to stand there without a care in the world, like he wasn't the one with all the power. With a sharp motion, he stepped closer, his hand resting on his baton. Just in case he needed to escalate this, he was ready. He had to be ready. The woman looked at his hand, but didn't flinch, didn't move a muscle. She was a puzzle, a riddle that he couldn't solve, and it frustrated him in a way he wasn't used to, but he didn't have time to figure her out. He just had to make her comply, make her listen, and then everything would go back to normal. He raised his voice again, this time demanding she step back and get into the car, but instead of responding to him, she did something that completely threw him off. She reached into her jacket and pulled out a small notebook and began flipping through the pages like she was in no rush, as if she had all the time in the world to deal with him. She didn't seem at all concerned about the situation. She didn't look like someone who was about to get arrested. She didn't even look like she was paying attention to him anymore. The officer stood frozen for a moment, his hand still on his baton, his mind racing, trying to process what was happening. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. She was supposed to react. She was supposed to show signs of guilt or fear. But instead she was so calm, so collected that it almost made him second-guess his entire decision to stop her. But he pushed the thought away. He wasn't about to back down now, not when he was so sure he was right. "You think you're above the law, don't you?" he muttered, more to himself than to her. But she didn't react to his words. She simply continued flipping through her notebook, taking her time, as if his presence meant nothing to her. The officer's patience was wearing thin as he watched her casually flip through the pages of her notebook, without a care in the world. He had never encountered someone like this before, someone who didn't flinch when faced with authority, didn't show the slightest sign of fear or anxiety. Something about it was starting to gnaw at him. He was used to people who panicked, who gave in to the pressure, but not her. She was different, and that difference unsettled him in ways he couldn't fully explain. It wasn't just her calm demeanor, it was the way she moved, the way she stood so unshaken, even in the face of his growing frustration. It was like she had an unspoken power over him, something he couldn't control. He was used to being the one in charge, but with her something felt off. His grip on the situation was slipping. He stepped even closer now, his voice cold and firm, as he demanded she hand over her ID at once. This time there was no room for negotiation. But once again she didn't react immediately. She didn't even look up from her notebook. She just continued to flip through the pages methodically. It was like he wasn't even there. She wasn't giving him what he wanted, and that angered him more than anything else had so far. The more she ignored him, the more his temper flared. He was losing control, and he didn't like it, not one bit. "What's your name?" he asked, the words coming out through gritted teeth this time. He was almost certain she had to break her silence. There was no way she could just keep acting like this. She had to comply eventually. She had to, but still she didn't say a word. She just kept on flipping through the pages of her notebook at an almost deliberate pace, as if his questions didn't matter at all. Her composure was maddening. He glanced around the street briefly, his eyes scanning for any signs of help. But it was late, and the street was empty. No one was around to witness what was happening. He was on his own. No one would come to stop him. If things went south, he had the power in this moment, and she was testing him. Every second that passed felt like a test, and he wasn't about to fail it. He had to act now. He reached for his radio, hand trembling slightly as he called in for backup, his voice shaky with a hint of uncertainty that he couldn't fully mask. He wasn't sure what to do next. He didn't know if he should arrest her right then and there or wait for backup. But as he called in the request, his mind kept racing. She wasn't a typical suspect. She didn't fit the profile of someone he could easily control. She didn't act like the others he had dealt with in the past, and that scared him more than he wanted to admit. She kept flipping through her notebook as if he hadn't said a word, and the officer felt a knot form in his stomach, a feeling that grew heavier by the second. He realized that he wasn't in control of the situation anymore, and it infuriated him. The thought of losing control over this moment was unbearable to him. He had always been the one who held the power in situations like this, and now here he was second-guessing himself. His hand shook as he reached for his cuffs. But before he could act, she suddenly closed her notebook and looked up at him, her gaze steady and unflinching. There was a silence between them that hung in the air like a thick fog. For a moment, neither of them spoke. She finally broke the silence, her voice calm but assertive. "I'm not going anywhere." She said it was a statement, not a challenge, but the officer heard it as both the words hung in his mind like a challenge to everything he thought he knew about power and authority. The officer's heart raced as her words lingered in the air. It was a simple statement, but it felt like a challenge the way she said it was like. She knew something he didn't like. She had already won in some way he didn't understand, yet he stood there frozen for a moment, unsure how to react. Her calmness was unnerving. It was almost as if she had anticipated every move he made before he even thought of it, and that made him uncomfortable. He had been in control of every situation before, but this felt different. She wasn't afraid, she wasn't reacting the way he expected, and that made him feel small. The silence stretched between them as he stared at her, his mind working overtime to figure out what to do next. But she didn't make a move. She just stood there, her posture straight, her expression unreadable, and that made the officer feel more uneasy than ever before. He wasn't used to feeling this way when dealing with suspects. They were always either scared or compliant. But she wasn't either of those things. She was something else, something he couldn't quite grasp, and it was frustrating. He cleared his throat and took a step back, trying to regain his composure. But even as he did, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. His instincts told him to arrest her right there, to take control of the situation before it spiraled out of hand. But another part of him hesitated. The way she stood there, so calm, so confident, made him second-guess himself in a way he never had before. He couldn't afford to hesitate, not in his line of work, but with her. Something made him stop. "What's your name?" he asked again. This time his voice was softer, less demanding than before, but it was still laced with suspicion, and he could hear the uncertainty creeping into his words. But the woman didn't respond, not right away. Instead, she gave him a long look, like she was weighing her options. Before she finally spoke, her words were deliberate, slow, and measured. "I'm with the FBI." She said it so simply, so casually, that it took a moment for the officer to process what she had just said. "FBI," he repeated the word, feeling like it had to be some kind of joke, like she was trying to throw him off or mess with him. But the woman didn't flinch, she didn't smile or make any indication that she was lying. She just looked at him with the same steady gaze, and for the first time he started to feel like maybe he was the one being played with. "Are you serious?" he asked, his voice now tinged with disbelief. But she didn't flinch at the question. She just nodded once, almost imperceptibly, as if she was telling him that this was no joke, no game to be played. She was telling the truth, and the officer could feel a wave of confusion washing over him. He hadn't been expecting this. He had never stopped someone only to have them reveal that they were an FBI agent. In fact, he had never even considered the possibility that someone like her could be more than they appeared. But even as he tried to process her words, his mind raced back to his own actions. He realized he had made a critical mistake. Something was wrong here. This wasn't just a routine stop. This wasn't just a random encounter. She was someone important, someone who knew how to handle herself under pressure, and that thought made the officer's stomach tighten with unease. Suddenly, he wasn't sure who was in control anymore. The woman stood in front of him, waiting patiently, her eyes never leaving his face. But there was no smugness, no arrogance in her demeanor, just a quiet strength that seemed to emanate from her every movement. It was like she was prepared for whatever came next, and the officer realized that for the first time in a long while he wasn't the one calling the shots, he wasn't the one holding all the power. "What are you doing here?" he asked, still trying to regain some semblance of control, but now his voice was shaky and uncertain. He felt the first stirrings of fear creeping into his chest as he realized just how far he had overstepped his boundaries and how badly this situation had slipped out of his hands. The woman didn't answer immediately. Instead, she seemed to consider his question, as if she was weighing whether or not to give him any more information. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, as if she could see through him, like She knew exactly what he was thinking. Her silence stretched on, and for a moment the officer felt like he was suffocating under the weight of his own confusion. His mind was racing. He had no idea how to handle this situation. Everything he thought he knew about power and control was slipping away from him like sand through his fingers. He wasn't sure who had the upper hand anymore, but deep down he knew it wasn't him. Finally, she spoke, her voice calm and steady. "I'm here on official business." She said her words slow but sure, and for the first time since the encounter started, the officer felt the full weight of what she had just revealed. FBI. She was with the FBI. It wasn't a lie. He could see it in her eyes. She wasn't making it up. He had made a terrible mistake. He tried to recover quickly, but it was clear he was losing his composure. His grip on the situation was faltering. The arrogance that had filled him at the beginning of this encounter was gone, replaced by a gnawing feeling of panic. What had he done? How could he have been so reckless, so blinded by his own bias that he failed to see who she really was? It was all starting to unravel. He had never felt so exposed, so vulnerable in his life. The woman seemed to notice his shift in demeanor. She didn't look smug, but he could sense the quiet strength in her posture. It was like she had anticipated this moment. She had known this was coming, and that made the officer feel even more off balance, like he was in over his head. "You've made a serious mistake," she said, her voice still calm, but with an edge now, and the officer felt a cold rush of dread wash over him. Her words cut through the air with a finality that he couldn't ignore. His stomach churned as he realized the gravity of the situation. He had arrested someone who wasn't just anyone. She was part of something much bigger, something that he had no understanding of. He was in deep now, and there was no way out. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words wouldn't come. It was like he had lost his ability to formulate a coherent thought. The officer stood there frozen, his eyes flicking nervously from side to side as he tried to figure out what to do next. But every option seemed worse than the last. He couldn't let her go, not now. But if he held her any longer, it would only make things worse. He was already in over his head, and the deeper he went, the harder it would be to get out. A sudden realization hit him like a ton of bricks. The case she was working on, it was the one he had been trying to bury for months. He had been involved in it in ways he didn't want to think about. He had been protecting people who were guilty of things that should have never been allowed to happen. And now this woman was the one who had uncovered it all. She was the one who had exposed him without even trying. She was here to clean up the mess he had helped create, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. His mind spun in a whirlwind of panic as he realized how badly he had miscalculated. He had arrested someone who was part of the FBI, an agent working on a case that he had been trying to bury, and now she was going to expose everything, all of his lies, all of his involvement in the corruption. He had been hiding from the world for so long. It was only a matter of time before it all came crashing down around him, and the officer felt his world unraveling at the seams. There was no escaping the consequences of his actions now. The officer's heart pounded in his chest as the reality of what he had done settled over him. Like a heavy cloud, his mind raced through 1,000 scenarios, trying to find a way out, but every option he considered seemed to lead him further into a corner he couldn't escape from. He had always been good at covering his tracks, at manipulating situations to his advantage. But this time, he had underestimated the woman standing in front of him. She wasn't just some civilian. She wasn't a suspect to be intimidated or controlled. She was part of a system far bigger than anything he could comprehend. And now that he had crossed the line, there was no turning back. She watched him carefully, her eyes never leaving his face, and for the first time he saw a flicker of something in her gaze. It wasn't triumph, it wasn't even satisfaction. It was more like quiet understanding, like she knew exactly what he was going through, like she had seen this before. She wasn't afraid of him. She wasn't rattled. She was simply waiting for him to accept the inevitable. He swallowed hard as the silence stretched between them. It was suffocating. He could feel his own panic rising, the weight of his mistakes pressing down on him. He had been part of a system that had protected the corrupt for too long, and now it was all coming crashing down around him. It was like a storm had been brewing just below the surface, and now that storm was finally breaking over his head. The woman didn't speak right away. She simply stood there waiting for him to make the next move, and he could feel the pressure mounting with every passing second. He had no idea what she was going to do next. He didn't know what she was thinking or what her next steps would be, but he could feel the eyes of the entire world on him. Now he had made a choice, and that choice was about to come back to haunt him. Finally, she spoke, her voice low and measured. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," she said, and the officer's stomach lurched at the words. It was like she was speaking directly into the depths of his fear, like she could see through him and knew the secrets he had spent years trying to bury. Her words were like a sharp needle poking at the very core of his guilt. "I know exactly who you are," she continued, her tone steady, but there was a hint of something behind her words, something that made him shiver. "You don't get to walk away from this. You don't get to keep hiding from what you've done." The officer's mind spun as he tried to grasp the full weight of what she was saying. He was trapped. He had made a fatal mistake by arresting her, and now there was no way out. The truth was closing in on him like a vice grip. He couldn't escape. He had been so sure of himself at the beginning of this encounter, so certain that he was in control, but now he realized how wrong he had been, and it terrified him. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He couldn't form a coherent sentence. His mind was blank with fear and uncertainty, and in that moment he knew he had lost everything: the job, the respect, the power. It was all slipping through his fingers like water, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. The woman took a step closer now, her presence looming over him, and he felt a wave of dread wash over him. He was no longer the one in control. He wasn't the one holding the power anymore. She was the one calling the shots, and he had no choice but to stand there and take it all in. She didn't need to say anything else. Her presence alone was enough to make him feel small, enough to make him understand that the consequences of his actions were about to come crashing down on him. He had no idea what was coming next, but he knew it wasn't going to be easy, and it wasn't going to be pretty. The storm was here, and there was no escaping it now. The officer stood frozen, his mind racing as the woman's words echoed in his ears. He felt the weight of his decisions crushing down on him. His entire world seemed to spin out of control. The fear that had started as a small tremor now gripped him fully. His palms were sweating, and his heart was racing in his chest. He had always been the one to hold the power to control situations, to make people fear him. But now it was all slipping away, and he had no idea how to get it back. The woman's steady gaze never wavered. She didn't move closer, but her presence seemed to fill the space around them like an invisible force. He could feel it pressing in on him. The silence between them stretched on, and he knew that she wasn't going to let him off the hook so easily. He had made his mistake, and now he had to face the consequences. But what were those consequences going to be? His mind flashed through all the possible scenarios. He knew that if she reported this, if she exposed what he had done, he was finished. His career was over, and worse than that, the secrets he had tried so hard to protect, the corruption he had been a part of for years, would all come to light, and he would be the one to pay for it. All he could feel the walls closing in on him as his options shrank to nothing. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. His throat was dry, and his tongue felt heavy. He couldn't bring himself to ask for forgiveness. He couldn't admit that he had messed up so badly. All he could do was stand there, like a deer caught in headlights, waiting for the inevitable. The woman seemed to sense his fear. She didn't smile. She didn't show any sign of satisfaction, but there was something in her eyes that made him feel like she was in control, like she was the one with the power now, and he was just a pawn in her game. The feeling of helplessness washed over him, and for the first time in a long time he realized how vulnerable he truly was. "Do you understand the gravity of what you've done?" she asked, her voice calm, but with a subtle edge that sent a shiver down his spine. He didn't answer at first. He couldn't. He didn't know how to explain himself. He didn't know how to make her understand that he had acted out of fear and bias, that he had let his own prejudices cloud his judgment. But as she waited for a response, the officer finally nodded slightly, his throat tight with the unspoken realization that his actions had set off a chain of events that could ruin him. The woman took a step back, but her eyes never left his face. Her presence was overwhelming, and he felt himself shrink under the weight of it. "All I suggest you think long and hard about the choices you've made," she said quietly before she turned and walked away, leaving the officer standing there in the cold night air, unable to move, unable to speak. He watched her disappear into the distance, his mind still reeling from everything that had just happened. As the silence settled over him, He couldn't help but feel a sense of impending doom, like the world was finally catching up with him. He had always managed to stay one step ahead, always found a way to escape the consequences. But now it felt different. The past was finally catching up, and there was nowhere left to hide. He had crossed a line, and there was no going back. For the first time since this entire ordeal began, the officer was left to confront the harsh truth. He had been so certain of his own righteousness, but now he realized how wrong he had been, how easily he had allowed his own biases to shape his actions, and the consequences were far greater than he could have ever imagined. The storm had come, and there was no escaping it now. He was left alone in the dark street, trembling with the weight of his own failure, and for the first time he understood the meaning of karma. The very thing he had so carelessly disrespected was now coming for him, and it wasn't going to be kind. The officer stood alone in the cold night air, his mind a whirl of confusion and fear. The weight of his actions pressed on him with every passing second, as if the world itself was reminding him of his misdeeds. He wanted to turn away, to run from the consequences, but deep down he knew that there was no escaping them, no more hiding from the truth. He had crossed a line he could never uncross, and now the storm he had ignored was crashing down on him in full force. As he stood there frozen in place, his mind raced back to the moment when he had first arrested her, when he had made the decision to treat her as just another suspect without considering the possibility that she was more than he could ever understand. He had been so consumed by his own prejudice, so sure that he was in control, but now he realized just how wrong he had been. He had been playing a dangerous game, and it was only now that he could see how much he had lost. He could still see her face in his mind, the calm way she had looked at him, like she already knew how this was going to end, like she had seen this play out 100 times before. Her quiet strength had unsettled him, but now he realized it had been a warning that he had ignored, and now the consequences were unfolding around him with every breath he took. His phone buzzed in his pocket, and he jolted at the sound, his hand shaking as he pulled it out and glanced at the screen. It was a message from his superior. He stared at it for a moment, trying to process what it meant. His stomach dropped as he read the words. The message was simple, but its meaning was clear. His superior had been informed about what had happened, and now everything was out in the open. The officer felt a wave of panic wash over him as the realization hit him like a punch to the gut. The game was over. He quickly typed a response, but his hands were shaking so badly he could barely type the words. The screen blurred in front of his eyes as he tried to maintain some sense of composure, but he knew deep down that this was the beginning of the end for him. There was no going back from this. He had made his bed, and now he would have to lie in it. A sudden thought flashed through his mind. The woman had said something that had stuck with him. You don't get to walk away from this. She had been right. There was no walking away from the mess. He had made no way to fix what had been broken. The damage was done, and now he would have to face the consequences of his actions, no matter how much he wished he could turn back time and undo everything. The officer took a deep breath and closed his eyes for a moment, trying to steady his racing heart. He knew he had to face what was coming, but the fear of it was almost paralyzing. He had never imagined that his life would come to this point, that one decision could unravel everything he had worked for. All the years of climbing the ladder, all the power he had held, it was all slipping through his fingers, and now he was left to pick up the pieces of his shattered life. As he stood there in the cold night air, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. He turned his head quickly, expecting to see someone, but the street was empty. The woman was gone, but her presence lingered like a shadow hanging over him. He couldn't escape it, couldn't escape the reality of what he had done. He began to walk slowly down the street, his steps heavy and slow, his mind still reeling from everything that had happened. He had no idea what the future held, but he knew one thing for sure: his life would never be the same again. The choices he had made had changed everything, and now he would have to live with the consequences for the rest of his life. As he walked into the night, the officer felt the actions. The officer's steps grew heavier with each movement, as if the weight of his mistakes was pressing him further into the ground with every footfall. He could no longer ignore the reality of the situation. He had tried to convince himself that he was still in control, that he could find a way out, But now there was no denying it, no denying that the path he had chosen had led him here to this moment of reckoning. The fear that had taken root in him earlier now felt like a constant companion wrapping around his chest, squeezing tighter with every breath he took. He could feel his heart pounding in his ears, his mind still replaying the moments with the woman, how calm and collected she had been, how effortlessly she had disarmed him with her presence and her words. And now it hit him like a tidal wave, the realization that she had known all along. She had known what he was and what he had done, but she had never said a word until it was too late. He couldn't help but think back to everything he had done, the lies he had told the people he had protected, the things he had turned a blind eye to for so long in the name of power and self-preservation. He had always believed that the system worked for him, that as long as he stayed on the right side of things, he would always come out on top. But now the system had turned on him, and there was no one left to protect him, no one to shield him from the consequences of his actions. The message from his superior still sat unread in his phone. He hadn't been able to bring himself to respond, yet he was afraid of what the next step would be, afraid of facing the truth that he couldn't run from any longer. But he knew that the time had come to face it. There was no hiding from this, no way to bury the truth any longer. He had to take responsibility for what he had done, even if it meant losing everything. As he walked aimlessly through the empty streets, his mind wandered to the woman again, to her calm demeanor, to the way she had handled the entire situation. It was like she had seen through him, like she knew exactly who he was and what he was capable of. And it made him feel exposed in a way he had never felt before. He had been so sure of himself in the past, but now he realized just how small he was in comparison to the forces at play, how powerless he really was. He reached a crossroads and stopped, standing there in the middle of the street, unsure of which way to go. He had nowhere to turn, no easy path to take. He had lost everything, and there was nothing left to do but face the consequences head on. With a shaky breath, he finally took out his phone and opened the message from his superior, his fingers trembling as he typed a simple response. He knew it was only a matter of time before everything came crashing down, but now he had no choice but to face it head on. No more lies, no more hiding from the truth. His message sent, he stared at the screen for a moment longer before slipping his phone back into his pocket. He didn't know what would happen next. He didn't know if he would be fired, arrested, or worse. But one thing was certain: his life as he knew it was over, and there was no going back from here. The storm had arrived, and there was no escaping the consequences of his actions.